How much do I have to know before I can become a Christian? That's pretty important, isn't it? How much do you have to know before you can really become a Christian, before you can become what some call saved? What do you have to know before you can do that? Well, where do we get our information about what we have to do and don't have to do? The Bible, right? So if we're going to be the people of the book, where should we look to get answers to these questions?
The Bible.
The Bible. Okay, so in Acts chapter 2, if you're not familiar with this setting here, this is where the church comes into existence. Before Acts 2, there was no church of Christ. There was no church. There were followers of Jesus and there were followers of God in the old days, but there was no church. So here, Acts chapter 2. And Peter and the apostles, they get up there in the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem and they start preaching to the crowd. And in one sermon, how many people became Christians?
1,000.
Not 1,000.
2,000.
Not 2,000. We're getting closer. All right.
12.
3,000 people, right? So look at Acts 2, verse 41. Acts 2, verse 41. So then those who had received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added about 3,000 souls. Now, so these people heard one sermon. It might have been a long sermon, but they heard one sermon and they knew enough to become Christians. That's interesting, isn't it? So are you saying all we need is one sermon and we can become Christians? Well, maybe. In this scenario, these people who obeyed the gospel, they were Jews, weren't they? So they were people who followed God under the Old Testament. So these people were devout Jews. That means they were very religious and they knew God's law really well. And they were obeying the law of Moses for a long time. So we might say, well, they had a head start. They knew God already. That's why it was easier for them to hear this one sermon. But what was it they needed to learn that day that they didn't know before? And the answer is the gospel. Okay, turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We need to know what the gospel is. And if I asked, I'm sure you could give me the answer. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul tells us exactly what the gospel is. 1 Corinthians 15, and everybody has to open their Bibles and turn to it. It's like a rule at Bible camp. You get thrown out if you don't. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he raised on the third day according to the Scriptures."